Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. He was the brightest star in a galaxy that had forgotten how to dream, the favored son, the bearer of the Emperor's hopes, and the idol of 1,000 worlds. Horus Lupercal was not born in darkness. He was not forged by hate or rebellion. He was created in light, luminous, noble, and devastatingly beloved. That is why his fall was not merely a tactical disaster or an act of heresy. It was a spiritual apocalypse. To understand the heresy is not to count the battles, but to trace the bleeding heart of a demigod who believed too deeply and then shattered when that belief was betrayed. There are truths that the history books, the codexes, and the countless canticles of the Imperium will never dare whisper. Truths about Horus's faith, not just in the Emperor, but in meaning, purpose, destiny. His faith was not a dogma. It was a feeling, a fire, a reason to breathe. And when that fire turned black, when it inverted into something monstrous, it didn't disappear. It transformed. The gods of chaos did not invent Horus's faith. They simply waited, patient and hungry, until it cracked, and then they drank it like wine. Before Horus was the War Master, before the Luna Wolves marched beneath his command, and before a single drop of blood was shed in rebellion, he was something far more fragile and profoundly human. A child forged in mystery, sculpted by longing, and baptized in belief. His arrival on the world of Chthoniya was not heralded with grandeur, but his spirit, even then, shimmered with an undefined hunger. Not for war, not for glory, but for belonging, for truth, for something to believe in. The Imperium speaks often of the biological excellence of the Primarchs, of their superhuman minds and godlike strength. But what they fail to tell you, what they deliberately silence, is that Horus's heart beat loudest not with ambition but with faith. From the moment the Emperor found him, the bond between them was more than military, more than paternal. It was spiritual. There was no other word for it. Horus did not simply obey the Emperor, he revered him. In the way a pilgrim reveres a prophet, in the way a dying man clutches at the robes of a healer. Horus saw in the Emperor not just a father, not just a king, but the answer to everything. To why he was made, to why the stars called to him, to why there had to be order in a galaxy choked in madness. The Emperor, for Horus, was divinity in disguise, a god who denied godhood not to diminish himself, but to elevate his sons into something nobler. In those early years, Horus absorbed the Emperor's vision like sacred scripture. He did not question the dream of unity, of science triumphing over superstition, of enlightenment seizing the throne of the cosmos. But unlike many of his brothers who served the vision with cold detachment or fanatical rigor, Horus felt it. It ignited his soul. He believed in the Great Crusade not just as a conquest, but as a crusade in the true old sense, a holy endeavor. Each planet brought into compliance was a candle lit in the void. Each culture uplifted from barbarism was a hymn sung to the future. This was not administration. This was liturgy. And yet, even in these golden days, the seeds of catastrophe were silently sown. Because Horus's belief was so total, so visceral, it had no defenses. He did not compartmentalize like Gilliman. He did not cynically manipulate like Perturabo. He did not insulate himself like the lion. He gave everything, his loyalty, his heart, his identity, to the Emperor. And what the Imperium never tells you is how dangerous that kind of love is. Because when such a man is betrayed, or even believes he has been betrayed, the ruin is not political, it is cosmic. You can almost trace the shape of Horus's downfall from these beginnings. Not in grand gestures or dark rituals, but in quiet, desperate moments. When he looked at the Emperor and mistook silence for abandonment, when he watched other brothers gain honors or autonomy and felt, perhaps only for a second, that his own love was unreciprocated. When he heard whispers that the Emperor was retreating to his secret project and thought, with aching dread, why did he not tell me? These are the fractures that no strategium can measure, the soft heartbreaks that can eventually birth a storm. His faith was not in abstract ideals. It was personal. That was its strength and its doom. Horus did not die the day he turned against Terra. He began dying the moment he felt the Emperor no longer believed in him. That is the wound the history books never write. Not the blade of Ezekiel Abaddon, not the sorcery of Erebus, but the simple, devastating realization that the God you believed in might not believe in you. The Emperor's vision for humanity was one of ruthless clarity, a future ruled by logic, reason, and unyielding secular order. He would not be worshipped. He would not be prayed to. He would not indulge the ancient, trembling instincts of faith. In a galaxy thick with superstition, demonic cults, and psychic madness, the Emperor sought to strangle every root of spiritual thought, replacing it with the iron truth of science and the manifest destiny of mankind's supremacy. It was, on the surface, a noble dream. But beneath its surface, it was an assault on the very nature of belief itself. And for someone like Horus, it would prove to be a slow-burning spiritual cage. The truth, rarely spoken even in the deepest catacombs of imperial archives, is that the Emperor built a cult of reason with the same fervor as any zealot erecting a shrine. He replaced saints with primarchs, miracles with technology, and scripture with compliance edicts. But it was still a faith, just one that called itself something else. And like all faiths, it demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and silence in the face of contradiction. For Horus, who had worshipped the Emperor with an open heart, this contradiction would become a wound far deeper than any blade could inflict. He had seen the Emperor walk through fire unscathed. He had watched him silence gods with a gesture, level cities with a thought, and speak in a voice that made the stars themselves feel closer. And yet this being, this living myth, insisted he was just a man. Horus wanted to believe him. He tried. But in private, in the hushed moments between conquests, he would ask himself, why should divinity be denied when it shines so clearly from him? He was not alone in this. Among the Luna Wolves and other legions, whispers passed like prayer beads, silent acknowledgments that the Emperor was more than he claimed to be. But only Horus bore the weight of knowing him as both father and god. The Emperor's insistence on eradicating religion was not just a tactical move against chaos or ignorance. It was an ideological tyranny, the demand that every soul conform to his version of reality. To Horus, this increasingly felt like betrayal. What had once been inspiring became suffocating. What had once given clarity now sowed doubt. Because when a man says he is not a god, but acts with the authority of one, rules with the judgment of one, and hides divine secrets from those he loves, is he not simply lying to you? The imperial truth, for all its logic, was an emotional vacuum. It left no room for wonder, for myth, for the sacred bonds that nourish meaning. Horus, who had thrived on connection, found himself drowning in this sterile light. He had no saints to pray to, no myth to guide him, no absolution for his fears. The Emperor had given him everything, but not the right to believe. And in doing so, he created a hollow inside his son, a hollow just wide enough for chaos to one day fill. The worst part was that the Emperor must have known. He must have seen the aching reverence in Horus's eyes, the way he sought not just orders, but assurance. Yet instead of nurturing that bond, he retreated. He built the Webway project in secret. He placed Malkador at his side and left Horus to carry the weight of the galaxy alone. It wasn't the abandonment of command that hurt Horus. It was the silence, the implication that his faith, so warm, so real, was childish, disposable, weak. And so slowly, faith began to rot inside Horus. Not disappear, not dissipate, but rot. Transformed into something unspoken, bitter, and waiting. He still carried the banners, still delivered the speeches, still smiled when the Emperor's name was cheered. But a part of him was already wondering if the thing he had loved had ever truly existed at all. This is the hidden tragedy of the heresy's beginning. That it did not start with ambition or rage, but with a son realizing that his god had no use for worship. The cult of reason may have conquered planets, it may have built empires, but in the heart of its greatest champion, it left only ashes. Ashes that would one day be rekindled by far darker fires. In the golden years of the Great Crusade, before the treachery, before the names of brothers became curses on the wind, there was a time when Horus stood not as a traitor, but as the center of something transcendent. It was a moment suspended in myth, not just because of the wars won or worlds brought to heel, but because of the spirit that bound the sons of the Emperor together. There was an unspoken sanctity in that brotherhood. Not political, not strategic, but spiritual. The Primarchs, for all their differences and rivalries, shared a sense of holy purpose. And Horus, more than any of them, gave voice to that purpose. He was not just the first among them. He was the light in which they gathered, the voice that made the impossible seem inevitable. In his presence, even gods might have paused to listen, not because of might, but because of meaning. When Horus spoke, his brothers felt seen, they felt believed in. And that belief, reciprocated, was the closest thing any of them had to communion. There was no temple, no altar, no choir, but what they built together was sacred nonetheless. Think of those rare and fleeting moments. Fulgrim and Horus, painting a mural with blood and brilliance, speaking of beauty and perfection. Ferrus Manus and Horus standing side by side before the forges of an alien world, both speaking the language of creation. Sanguinius, wings outstretched, laughing beside Horus as they descended into the jungles of a forgotten moon to free slaves with no cameras to record it. These were not operations. These were sacraments. Each encounter layered with symbolism, intimacy, and a sense that they were part of something eternal. Even Lorgar, in his early zeal, found in Horus a figure he could believe in more than the emperor himself. Not because Horus demanded worship, but because he embodied belief. He listened. He cared. He did not dismiss the sacred out of hand. Though he still spoke the language of the imperial truth, Horus had begun to acknowledge in his heart, if not his orders, that there was something holy about what they were doing. And in doing so, he became a nexus of emotional gravity, a place where their fractured dreams could briefly become whole. But these moments, as brilliant as they were fragile. They existed only in the in-between spaces, the quiet after a campaign, the celebration in the mess hall, the pause before the next world burned. And perhaps they were too delicate to last. Because as the Great Crusade pressed on, those sacred moments began to disappear, eroded by bureaucracy, distance, and the Emperor's growing silence. The brothers were scattered across the stars, increasingly isolated, increasingly burdened. And without the shared light of Horus's presence, many of them began to dim. What no one realized at the time was that Horus was feeding on those moments too. He needed them. He believed in them. They were his proof that this journey, this brutal, endless march, was more than conquest, that it had a soul, that it was, in some way, divine. Without them, the warmth in him began to cool, not quickly, not obviously, but inevitably. And still, when the brothers gathered, even in strained times, there was that flicker. The way they looked at him, the way they listened, the way they forgave his sharpness, his pride, his choices, because they too remembered the sacredness of what had once been. And though none of them dared to say it, many of them believed that if anyone could bring back that feeling, that unity, that grace, it would be Horus. What the histories fail to convey is how deeply loved he was. Not out of fear or duty, but with genuine, soul-deep affection. He was the center of their myth, their shared belief. And in a galaxy without gods, that made him something holy. That love, that collective faith, was not crushed in a single moment. It decayed, corrupted, and was finally betrayed. But while it lived, it was something the universe had rarely seen. A brotherhood not of warriors, but of apostles in armor, marching not just for order, but for something that felt like truth. The legion once called the Luna Wolves were more than soldiers. They were believers, fervent, loyal, almost monastic in their dedication. But their faith was not in the Emperor, it was in Horus. While the wider Imperium toiled under the distant gaze of Terra's godlike ruler, the Luna Wolves marched to the heartbeat of their warmaster. They loved him. They idolized him. To many, he was the true Emperor. Not in title, but in spirit. His charisma, his presence, his unshakable confidence created a cult of belief so total it could eclipse even the truth. This was not a blind or stupid devotion. It was earned. Horus fought beside his sons, laughed with them, mourned with them. He knew their names, their stories, their scars. He listened. He cared. While other primarchs ruled with cold distance or rigid hierarchy, Horus created a culture of inclusion and pride. He did not speak down to his sons. He lifted them up. And in return, they would have walked into the eye of terror itself without hesitation. For them, Horus was the light in the darkness. The dream made flesh. The father they chose, not the one assigned by genetics. Over time, this bond deepened into something stranger, more reverent. The Mournival, his inner circle, became his apostles in all but name. Garviel Loken, Tarik Torgadon, Ezekiel Abaddon, they didn't just serve Horus, they lived for him. When he suffered, they suffered. When he triumphed, their joy was almost spiritual. There was no name for this kind of loyalty in the dry language of military doctrine. It was faith, pure and absolute, and it became a foundation stone for everything Horus would later build and ultimately destroy. Inside the Legion, rituals began to form, small, informal, yet profoundly meaningful. Certain phrases of Horus were quoted like scripture. Jokes he made were retold with reverence. His victories were painted not just in tactical murals, but in allegorical visions. Songs were sung in low voices in the barracks, invoking not the emperor's name, but Lupercal's. Some captains wore charms bearing his image. Some junior officers meditated on his strategies as if they were parables. All of it unsanctioned, undocumented, and yet more alive than anything in the imperial creed. And Horus saw this. He felt it. And though he never commanded it, he never truly stopped it either. Because a part of him, the part still reaching out for connection, for meaning, needed it. The belief of his sons filled a growing void inside him. The more the emperor withdrew into silence, the more the Luna Wolves gave Horus the love he had once reserved for his father. In time, their adoration became a mirror. He began to see himself not just as a general or brother, but as the living embodiment of a higher cause. Not the emperor, but an emperor. This transformation did not happen in a moment. It was gradual, insidious. The whispers began long before Davin. That Horus, not the emperor, should lead mankind. That he, not Terra, understood the heart of the crusade. These were not seeds planted by chaos, not yet. They were sown by the desperate longing of his sons for a leader who believed in them as they believed in him. And that longing, over years and campaigns, reshaped the Legion's soul. The rebranding of the Luna Wolves to the Sons of Horus was not simply a political act. It was the final confirmation of what had already happened in their hearts. They had become disciples. Their loyalty to the Emperor was an echo, a formal pretense. But their true allegiance, their true worship, was for the War Master. When Horus renamed them, he was not just honoring them. He was acknowledging the truth. And in doing so, he stepped fully into the role they had already given him. It is one of the great ironies of the heresy that Horus, who once fought to dismantle religion, found himself at the center of a legion-spanning spiritual movement, a cult not born from demonic influence, but from love, devotion, and the deep, unquenchable human need to believe. That faith became a prison, not just for his sons, but for Horus himself. Because when a god is made by the hands of his worshippers, he cannot afford to disappoint them. He must become what they see, even if it breaks him. And it did break him. Long before chaos entered his veins, long before the final battle, Horus had already surrendered to a darker fate. He became the god his sons believed in, and in doing so, lost the man who once looked to the stars with hope. Davin was a scar not just upon Horus's body, but upon his soul, a rupture through which chaos poured not only its power, but its narrative. It is easy to reduce the moment to a simple ambush, a wound inflicted by treacherous hands and healed by even darker forces. But the truth is far more haunting. Davin was not a physical defeat. It was a moment of spiritual dislocation. In the stinking swamps of that cursed moon, Horus Lupercal did not merely fall to a blade. He fell into a question he had long feared to ask. What if the Emperor was wrong? The wound was brutal, yes. A blade of unnatural origin, black with corruption, thrust into his side by a warrior long thought loyal. But it was not the pain that brought Horus to the edge of death. It was what the wound represented. Betrayal, not just of flesh, but of meaning. Erebus's schemes, the Serpent Lodge's lies, the manipulation of chaos, all of it hinged on a single, devastating moment of vulnerability. And they found it. Not in Horus's arrogance, nor his rage, but in his need to understand. While his body failed and the apothecaries labored in desperation, Erebus carried him into the lodge, into the hands of the gods. And in the moments that followed, Horus was taken somewhere else, not in body, but in soul. A vision, a dream, a lie built on truths he was never meant to see. He saw a future. Mankind enslaved by bureaucracy, the Emperor worshipped as a false god, the Primarchs dead or forgotten, and himself absent from the annals of history. It was not a vision of glory denied, it was a vision of meaning erased, and it broke him. Because in that moment, the faith that had sustained him, the belief in his father's plan, in the righteousness of the crusade, in the sacred brotherhood of the legions, cracked. Not because the vision was true, but because it felt true. It matched the whispers he had silenced in his own heart. It gave shape to every unease, every moment of doubt, every wound left to fester. The gods did not forge new lies. They only twisted the truth Horus had already buried. He had always wanted to believe that the Emperor saw him, that he was not merely first among many, but truly chosen. And when he realized, or thought he realized, that the Emperor was building a new pantheon without him, when he saw the secret of the webway, the betrayal of silence, the future in which mankind worshipped a man who refused to be a god, it felt like abandonment on a cosmic scale. And so, in the presence of those dark entities, Horus did not cry out in fear. He listened, he believed, not because he had fallen, but because he had been waiting for someone, anyone, to make sense of the pain. And chaos did. It gave him answers, terrible ones, seductive ones, but answers nonetheless. The rituals performed upon his broken body were acts of both healing and unmaking. His flesh was restored, but his soul was rewritten. He rose not as a puppet, but as a convert, a believer with a new gospel. And the terrible irony is this: what saved him was not hate, it was faith. The gods showed him a lie, but they filled it with such emotional resonance, such dreadful beauty, that he embraced it. Not because he wanted power, but because he needed meaning. What no record dares admit is that Horus died on Davin. Not in the physical sense, but in the way that all believers die when their god fails them. The War Master who awoke was not the same man. He still bore Horus's memories, his voice, his charm, but his purpose had shifted. He no longer marched for the Emperor. He marched against the lie he had once called father. And so, the wound on Davin was not an assassination. It was a crucifixion of belief. Horus did not rise from that altar as a villain. He rose as a prophet of a new faith, dark, chaotic, and insatiable. A faith that demanded the destruction of all that once gave him light. In the fever-dream depths of his near-death trance, Horus was given a vision, or rather he was given a story. A myth built not from imagination, but from the twisted bones of things he had always suspected but dared not name. The vision was not crude or brutal. It was beautiful. That was its genius. Erebus, the dark architect behind the scene, did not throw Horus into a pit of demons screaming incoherence. He built a cathedral of ideas. He crafted a gospel with just enough truth to feel undeniable. And in the sacred silence of that vision, Horus was made to believe he had finally seen the truth. Not a lie, not an illusion, but revelation. He stood in the ashes of a dead future. Mankind, no longer free but enslaved. Terra, not a capital of enlightenment, but a hive of religious fanaticism. The Emperor, now worshipped as a god, not for what he had done but for the myth he had allowed to fester. And above all, Horus saw himself nowhere, his name forgotten, his deeds erased. His brothers scattered or broken, some mad, some murdered. The legions, once so full of fire and spirit, reduced to servile relics of a golden age drowned in blood. This was the gospel Erebus offered, that Horus had been used, that he was never meant to rule, that the Emperor's promises were always lies. And what made it work, what made it so devastating, was that it did not ask Horus to renounce love. It asked him to protect it. It made him believe that rebellion was salvation, that betrayal was redemption, that to turn against the Emperor was not to fall, but to rise. There is a terrible power in false revelations that wear the mask of truth. They do not need to be accurate, they only need to be emotionally correct. And Horus, already filled with doubt, already aching with the burden of command, already feeling the slow, creeping silence of his father's absence, embraced this vision with a hungry heart. Because finally, someone had explained his pain. He did not rise from the vision enraged, he rose inspired. That is the horror no one dares speak of. Horus did not come back a raving madman. He came back calm, composed, focused. He had seen the truth, and now he had a purpose. The gods did not seduce him with promises of power, they gave him something far more dangerous. Meaning, the terrible, infectious kind of meaning that makes monsters think they are saints. To his sons, his Mournival, his allies, Horus returned with a new clarity. He spoke not of vengeance, but of liberation, not of conquest, but of truth. He began to frame the Emperor not as a god denied, but a tyrant exposed. He painted the crusade not as a holy mission, but a cruel joke. And he offered his followers not just cause, but conviction. They weren't turning traitor, they were becoming enlightened. The brilliance of this false revelation was how it inverted the sacred into the profane. Everything Horus had once held dear, brotherhood, loyalty, sacrifice, was not cast aside. It was redefined, recast in the fire of a new belief system where chaos was not evil but inevitable, where resistance was not faithlessness but courage, where the gods were not hungry spirits but ancient truths waiting to be acknowledged. This is what no campaign dossier or imperial sermon will admit. Horus believed, truly, deeply, and that belief made him all the more terrifying because he did not doubt his path. He did not waver. He preached. With the fire of a zealot and the charisma of a born savior, he became the prophet of a dark renaissance. Not because chaos corrupted him, but because chaos gave him the answers he had long been denied. The false revelation was not a moment, it was a conversion. A baptism in meaning, in which all of Horus's doubts and griefs were not dismissed, but validated. And that is why he could look into the eyes of his loyal sons, Loken, Torghadan, and see not betrayal in their defiance, but blindness. That is why he could order their deaths with sorrow instead of hatred. He did not believe he was killing truth. He believed he was silencing those too scared to accept it. The gods didn't need to lie loudly. They only needed to whisper the things Horus already feared. And once he listened, once he believed, they did not need to enslave him. He enslaved himself to a cause that felt righteous, to a future he now saw as salvation. And in doing so, he became something far more terrifying than a traitor. He became an apostle. When Horus emerged from the darkness of Davin, he did so not as a pawn of chaos, but as its champion, willingly, purposefully, and with the fervor of a man reborn. But unlike the daemons that whispered through the veil, Horus did not see himself as damned. He saw himself as liberated. He had shed the burdens of doubt, of unanswered loyalty, of silent heartbreak. In its place, a new faith rose. Dark, unholy, but no less sincere. Horus believed again. And that belief, raw and fearless, became the fire that would consume the stars. This is the part the imperial historians try to erase, that Horus's faith after Davin was not madness. It was clarity. He understood the truth of chaos not as a distortion, but as the natural order. The emperor had denied this truth, cloaked it in the false purity of reason. But Horus had seen it unveiled, and he did not flinch. Where once he had knelt before a man who refused to be called a god, he now stood among gods who demanded no lies. The Chaos Pantheon, for all its cruelty, offered Horus what the emperor never could: divinity with honesty. He was not coerced. He was fulfilled. He had seen the future that awaited under the emperor, a hollow age of stagnation, spiritual starvation, and cruel bureaucracy parading as enlightenment. The gods promised something else. An empire not of rules but of passion, not of silence but of song and scream and transcendence. A galaxy where man was not merely a cog in a broken machine, but a being of will and flame. For Horus, chaos was not corruption, it was evolution. And so he carried his new faith into every chamber, every war council, every whispered conversation. He did not spread it like disease, he spread it like gospel. His voice, once filled with warmth and command, now carried the deep cadence of belief. He spoke of destiny, of liberation, of truths buried by centuries of imperial silence. To his sons, he promised not just victory, but purpose. No longer would they bleed for a god who refused to acknowledge them. They would burn worlds for gods who answered. The transformation was spiritual. You could see it in the way he stood, the way he looked at his brothers. Gone was the weariness of command. In its place, conviction. He did not tremble at the cost. He believed it was worth it. Each world that fell, each brother who joined his cause became a hymn to the new order. Chaos was not disorder to him. It was truth revealed. An order older than the stars, and more honest than the emperor's cold vision of utopia. What truly haunts this era, what makes Horus's fall so uniquely terrifying, is the sincerity of it all. He wasn't pretending, he wasn't possessed in the way mortals are. He chose this path, and he walked it with eyes wide open. Not out of hate, but out of a belief so deep, it made betrayal feel like virtue. He came to see the heresy not as a rebellion, but as a crusade. A holy war for the soul of mankind, where the lie of the emperor had to be burned away to make room for the real gods. The rituals began quietly at first, symbols etched on armor, words in forgotten tongues whispered before battle. Slowly, belief turned into praxis. The sons of Horus, no longer Luna wolves, became devotees. each victory an offering, each corpse a tithe. Their war became a liturgy of fire and transformation. And Horus stood at the center, not as a tyrant, but as a priest-king, a god in becoming. What makes it all so unbearable in retrospect is how earnest it was. Horus wasn't a man seeking revenge, he was a man seeking truth. He had given his heart once, and it had been discarded. Now he gave it again, to chaos. And chaos, unlike the Emperor, answered. It whispered back, it promised more, and for a time it delivered. Visions, power, the adoration of millions. Horus began to believe not just in the gods, but in his own transformation, that he was ascending. That he was becoming the god the galaxy needed. This faith, this unholy conviction, would make him all the more dangerous. Not because it made him cruel, cruelty had always been a tool of war, but because it made him righteous. And righteousness without constraint is the most apocalyptic force in the universe. When Horus declared war on Terra, he was not simply claiming a throne. He was declaring the reformation of reality, one soul, one planet, one shattered dream at a time. When Horus began to spread the heresy, he did so not like a general mustering his forces, but like a prophet unveiling a revelation. The War Master did not merely command legions. He converted them. With words, with conviction, with the terrifying sincerity of someone who believed he was saving the Imperium from itself. He spoke with the gravity of a saint and the fire of a zealot, and the words he chose were not the declarations of a traitor. They were scripture. Not a single loyalist who heard him failed to feel the pull, even if they resisted it. Because Horus wasn't just offering power, he was offering truth. He did not shout, he did not threaten, he reasoned, he explained. And then he inspired. His voice carried the ring of old wounds understood, of forbidden thoughts finally spoken aloud. The Emperor has abandoned us, he would say, not with bitterness, but with sorrow. He has forgotten who built this Imperium. We have bled for his vision, and now he hides, cloaked in secrets, shaping a future without us. These were not the words of rebellion, they were the words of revelation, and they struck like lightning. To Fulgrim, he whispered not commands but validation. The pursuit of perfection, long mocked or misunderstood by others, was not vague vanity, Horus said, it was transcendence. To Perturabo, he offered not promises but recognition. The architect of sieges, the unappreciated genius, would no longer be a tool but a godmaker. To Mortarion he granted freedom from the Emperor's psychic tyranny. To Angron he promised vengeance for slavery and lies. To each brother, Horus spoke as if he knew their pain intimately. Because he did. And in those conversations he did not lie. He simply told the truth through the lens of faith. Even those who refused him, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Vulcan, heard his voice not as madness but as temptation. And in that, he became more dangerous than any blade or daemon ever could. He wasn't converting fools. He was awakening believers. His words were heavy with purpose, soaked in conviction. To hear Horus speak was to be reminded of every doubt you'd buried, every unease you dared not name. And in the clarity of his cause, you could feel the heat of something divine. Even if it scorched you. His own sons were the first to fully adopt this new gospel. The transformation of the Luna Wolves into the Sons of Horus was not a branding exercise. It was a rebirth. They became missionaries of the Lupercalian creed. Their war cries became prayers, their oaths, sermons. They moved across the stars like black-clad angels of revelation, preaching the new truth with bolter and blade. And to many, it worked, not through fear, through belief. Entire legions, entire forge worlds, even portions of the Mechanicum, bent the knee not because they were threatened, but because Horus's vision felt right. It was never simply about opposing the Emperor. It was about correcting him. Horus saw the heresy not as betrayal, but as restoration. The Emperor had strayed from the truth. He had become a silent god who refused to answer prayer, who shackled mankind's soul in the name of progress. Horus, in contrast, offered a new gospel. Ascend or perish. Join the tide of evolution or drown in the delusion of order. It was terrifying, it was exhilarating, and for many it was undeniable. Even among those who ultimately resisted, there were moments of hesitation. Think of Loken, who saw his beloved War Master weep in frustration. Think of Malagurst, who began as a pragmatist and ended as a preacher. Even Abin, the darkest of Horus's sons, did not follow merely out of duty. He believed. He saw something in Horus, something holy. something final. When he later turned from chaos, it was not because he ceased to believe in Horus. It was because the gods had proven unworthy of him. The Gospel of Lupercal was more than rhetoric. It was a spiritual movement, a moment in galactic history when millions of beings, soldiers and statesmen alike, were given a chance to abandon a dying order and embrace a new, terrifying future. Horus made them feel like architects of destiny, not slaves to a throne, and in doing so he ensured that his war would not end with him. Because ideas once spoken with such fire do not die easily. They linger. They echo. Even now, in the warp, they say his voice can still be heard, not screaming, preaching. Garviel Loken never stopped believing in Horus. Not really. That was the tragedy. Even as the signs grew darker, even as words twisted and brothers changed, Loken held on to the man he had once followed. Not as a soldier to a general, but as a soul to its guiding light. When Horus began to change, Loken did not suspect corruption. He feared sorrow. He thought his war master was being pulled by unseen burdens, made colder by the vast weight of command. He could not conceive of betrayal, because to Loken, Horus was the faith. That is what makes the heresy so unbearable. It was not just a war, it was the betrayal of the faithful by the one they believed in. Tarik Torgadon, who had laughed beside Horus in 100 fire-lit camps, died in confusion. Not rage, not fear. Confusion. Killed not for defying chaos, but for failing to surrender the last part of himself that still loved Horus, for not being able to see the new gospel as truth, for clinging to an older, more innocent light. And then there is Fulgrim, perhaps the saddest mirror of all. Fulgrim did not follow Horus as a puppet. He fell as a believer. In Horus, he saw not rebellion but vindication. That beauty mattered. That transcendence was not weakness. Fulgrim's damnation came not through temptation alone, but through trust. A trust that Horus, of all beings, understood what it meant to believe in something so completely, so devastatingly, that it consumed you. Fulgrim's betrayal was not only of the Emperor, it was of himself. And it was Horus who handed him the mirror. Sanguinius. Oh, Sanguinius. The one who knew, perhaps more than any other, what was truly coming. Who felt the rupture in the fabric of destiny. Who dreamed of the moment when Horus's hand would rise against him. And yet, he still hoped. Until the very end. When he entered the vengeful spirit, when he climbed those long, echoing corridors toward the final confrontation, it was not hatred that filled his heart, it was grief. Because he too had loved Horus, and the pain of losing him, not to death but to belief, was a wound no resurrection could ever heal. This is the essence of what was betrayed, not strategy, not loyalty, but faith. The quiet, profound, unspoken connection that had made the legions more than armies, that had made brothers of monsters, that had made meaning out of slaughter. Horus did not just break oaths, he broke hearts. He took the faith of those closest to him and used it to burn the galaxy. And he knew it. That is the coldest truth. He knew. When he gave the order that killed Ferrus Manus, when he unleashed the word-bearers upon Calth, when he turned Abaddon loose on those who would not kneel, he did not act with delusion. He acted with conviction. And beneath that conviction, buried deep, was the ghost of guilt. Because Horus remembered, even if he pretended not to. He remembered the laughter of Loken, the elegance of Fulgrim's compliments, the stormy glances of Perturabo. He remembered Sanguinius's wings in the firelight. He remembered how much he had once belonged. But belief, once chosen, is a prison. And Horus had chosen. The gods had not stolen him. They had given him a place to stand. And from that place, he destroyed the world he had helped build. It is easy to see the loyalists as heroes, and they were. But what the chronicles rarely admit is how much they lost. Not just comrades, not just innocence, but meaning. They had believed in Horus, in a brotherhood that transcended the Emperor's cold will. When Horus fell, he didn't just drag legions with him, he dragged hope into the abyss. And those who survived, Malcador, Dorn, even the Emperor himself, never quite recovered, because they saw what it looked like when love turned to ash. When faith, pure and radiant, was betrayed by the very hand that once nurtured it. In the echo of Horus's fall, they heard the end of something sacred. Not just trust, but truth. The heresy was never just a civil war. It was a cataclysm of belief, a holy war where each side saw itself as the last flame of truth in a universe going dark. For Horus, every thunderous footfall upon a loyalist world, every legion that turned its colors, every brother who bent the knee or died refusing, it all fed into the myth he had chosen to embody. His was not a war for territory. It was a doctrine, one written in fire and flesh, meant to tear the Imperium's soul from its decaying body. The irony is staggering. The Great Crusade had once set out to extinguish superstition, to replace gods with reason. But the heresy revealed that faith is inevitable, even in its absence. Humanity does not escape belief, it transforms it. The Emperor, in rejecting godhood, had not killed religion. He had only made himself the first martyr of a new one. And Horus, in his wrath and vision, declared a gospel of his own. Each legion became a sect, each war zone a cathedral. The word-bearers turned planets into pulpits. The Death Guard, diseased and rotting, preached the inevitability of decay. The World Eaters, drenched in blood, saw every heartbeat as an offering. And the sons of Horus, the very heart of it all, marched with the calm of missionaries, spreading not chaos as a concept, but Horus's truth. That the Emperor was a tyrant, that the future was a lie, that mankind could be free only through spiritual fire. And what of the loyalists? They too began to believe, not in the Emperor's dream, but in resistance. The imperial fists carved statues of defiance. The salamanders wept for humanity, even as they burned to defend it. The blood angels, caught between beauty and doom, began to see themselves as tragic angels. Even the ultramarines, once so rational, found themselves clinging to a kind of faith, in duty, in structure, in survival. The heresy forced them all to feel, to believe, in something more than orders. This was the holy war for mankind's soul. And it was Horus who lit the flame, not Erebus, not the ruinous powers, they merely offered the kindling. But Horus was the match, because he did not seek destruction for its own sake. He sought transformation, a spiritual reordering of the galaxy. He wanted mankind to shed its chains, its lies, its cold logic, and he believed that only fire could reveal the truth hidden beneath the rot. The battles, in this light, become sacraments. Istvan was a crucifixion, Prospero a prophecy, Calth a heretical schism. Every act of violence was a sermon, every scream a hymn. The heresy became a liturgy of madness, where both sides believed they were saving humanity, one by preserving a dying truth, the other by burning it to reveal the divine spark beneath. And at the center of this cataclysm stood Horus, neither holy man nor god, not yet daemon, but no longer merely flesh. He was a belief incarnate. The living contradiction. The beloved son who rose in rebellion not because he hated the Imperium, but because he believed it could be something more, something real, something true. But belief is a fire no one can control. As the heresy spread, as planets turned and whole sectors screamed his name, Horus began to see what all prophets eventually learn: that faith, once unleashed, devours the faithful. The war he had envisioned as purification became chaos unchained. Brothers once certain now wavered. Daemons spoke louder than dreams. The gods began to demand what had never been offered. And Horus, so sure of his path, so certain of his faith, began to feel the edges fray. Because even the truest gospel, when written in blood, begins to blur. Still, he did not stop. Because by then, the heresy was no longer just his rebellion. It was a war of faiths, and Horus had become its messiah. Whether it ended in victory or annihilation, he would be remembered not as a general, but as a god of war, a prophet of darkness, and the man who dared to challenge the soul of the galaxy itself. And in that, he was right. Even in defeat, Horus became the symbol he always feared he would be. The symbol of a truth too terrible to live, and too powerful to die. Even as the heresy neared its crescendo, as Terra braced beneath storm clouds of fire and steel, Horus began to unravel, not in power, not in command, but in certainty. The gods still spoke, the legions still obeyed, but within the core of the War Master, something began to fracture. Because faith, even dark faith, is not immune to rot, and Horus had built his new gospel on convictions so complete it left no room for doubt. When doubt finally came, it came like a whisper wrapped in thunder. Slow, quiet, and impossible to silence. The signs were subtle at first. He grew more isolated, more severe. His laughter faded. His moments of tenderness, those rare sparks of the old Horus, became fossils buried beneath layers of dogma and fury. And though he still preached the truth of chaos, still spoke the liturgy of the new order, There was a growing hollowness behind his eyes. He had begun to question, not his actions, but his reasons. The flame that once burned with purpose now flickered with anxiety. Had he seen truth, or had he simply been shown what he wanted to believe? The demonic presence that once flattered him now pressed harder. The gods, never content with silence, began to demand. They had given him strength, yes, visions, immortality, legions of nightmare made real. But they were no longer just patrons. They were jailers. Horus was their chosen, but not their equal. And he began to feel it, the slow erasure of his own will beneath their ceaseless hunger. The man who had rejected servitude now found himself a vessel, a prophet forced to speak words that no longer felt entirely his own. And yet, he could not admit it, not to his sons, not to his brothers, and not to himself. Because to admit that his faith was cracking would be to invalidate the war, to invalidate the millions who had died for him. He carried their belief now, whether he wanted to or not. He had to be strong, he had to believe, or it would all collapse. This is the quiet horror of his final days. Not rage, not madness, but the unbearable weight of maintaining belief in the face of mounting contradictions. Horus, who once breathed certainty like air, now began to suffocate on it. The visions became stranger, the gods grew impatient. His dreams, once filled with prophecy, now throbbed with doubt. He began to ask questions he dared not finish. Did the emperor truly mean to discard him? Was chaos freedom, or simply another prison? Even his sons began to sense the shift. Abaddon, ever loyal, saw in his father not weakness, but burden. He began to protect Horus not just from enemies, but from himself. Malagurst whispered prayers more often than orders. The legion, once ablaze with zeal, moved with a heaviness that mirrored its master. They were winning, but what were they becoming? And then there were the moments of silence, alone on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, gazing at the void. Horus would sometimes sit unmoving for hours, thinking, remembering, regretting, not the war, not the rebellion, but the way he had changed. He missed being Horus, the old Horus, the one who laughed with Loken, who painted with Fulgrim, who dreamed of a better future with Sanguinius. That man was gone, sacrificed on the altar of belief. And all that remained was a symbol. And symbols once forged cannot be unmade. That was his curse, to become the very thing he had tried to destroy, a god worshipped, unreachable, alone. The emperor, in his cold divinity, had become a hollow icon, and Horus, in his passionate rebellion, had become another. Two false gods, mirrors of each other, dragging humanity into the abyss of their shattered faiths. The heresy did not die when Horus fell. It began to die when he stopped believing, when he started pretending, when he became the vessel of something he no longer fully understood. His eyes still burned with fire, his voice still moved worlds. But inside, the core had cracked, and the gods could smell it. They began to tighten their grip, to twist his image, to prepare for what came next. Not Horus the Messiah, but Horus the sacrifice. Because faith, especially when it breaks, must end in martyrdom. And Horus, though he did not know it yet, was marching not toward a throne, but toward a funeral. It ended in a cathedral of silence, not of stone and glass, but of fire and blood and ancient lies collapsing under their own weight. The final confrontation aboard the vengeful spirit was not merely a duel between gods. It was the death of belief. The last unmasking of a tragedy, 10,000 years in the making. Horus did not meet the emperor as a rebel. He met him as a son. And though the stars burned outside, though titans fell and legions screamed, what truly mattered in that last moment was not the war. It was the faith that had once bound them together, now shattered. Horus waited for him. Crowned in ruin, cloaked in power that pulsed with warp light, he stood in his sanctum. Not triumphant, but ready. This was never about survival. Horus knew that now. Somewhere beneath the hate, beneath the divine armor and demonic whispers, he understood. This was a conclusion, not a conquest, a reckoning, a final truth. And when the emperor stepped into that chamber, wounded and radiant, Horus felt not fear, but recognition. There was no great speech, no theatrical confrontation. What passed between them was deeper than words. The emperor, the man who refused to be worshipped, now stood before the son who had built a religion out of betrayal. They looked at one another, and in that moment, everything was laid bare. Horus saw the emperor not as a god or tyrant, but as himself. A being who had tried to shape meaning from chaos, who had demanded loyalty without love, and who had in his silence created the very monster he now came to slay. And the Emperor, he saw what remained of Horus. Not the War Master, not the arch-traitor, but the boy who once looked up at him on the plains of Chthoniya and asked, "Why was I made?" And for that fraction of a heartbeat before the blades were drawn, there was grief. Infinite, cosmic, unbearable. But it passed. Because faith once broken does not forgive. They fought, but not just with weapons. Every blow was a scream, every parry a memory. The Emperor fought not just to end Horus, but to end the belief Horus had come to represent. And Horus in turn fought not just to kill the Emperor, but to justify everything he had done. Because if the Emperor died, then Horus had been right. Then the betrayal was salvation. Then the faith he had built, dark, corrupt, impossible, would become truth. And yet Horus faltered. There are stories that in those last seconds he saw the horror, that the veil lifted and he understood what he had become, that the gods, having used him, no longer needed him, that he had never been ascending, only consumed, and that moment of clarity was his undoing. Because the Emperor, seeing that flicker of remorse, unleashed the fullness of his power. Not out of victory, but out of mercy. He did not destroy Horus in hatred, he released him. The blow that ended the War Master did not just shatter his body, it shattered the myth. The war of faith ended not with a coronation, but with silence. And when the Emperor fell beside his son, broken beyond healing, it was not triumph, it was grief made manifest. Two gods dying together, bound not by hatred, but by love, betrayed. What remained after was ash. The Imperium endured, yes, the loyalists survived, but the light was gone. The Emperor became the very god he had refused to be, silent, immortal, enshrined. And Horus, the prophet of rebellion, was erased so completely that even his name was forbidden. The galaxy had no room left for faith, only dogma. Yet, his echo remains. In the warp, in the dreams of traitors, in the rage of the Black Legion, Horus's gospel flickers still. Not as glory, not as truth, but as warning. That faith, when misled, can move suns. That belief, when broken, can damn even the brightest souls. And that sometimes the greatest evil comes not from hatred, but from love that dared too much. The heresy is over, but the faith Horus once carried, the raw, terrifying need to believe in something greater, will never die. And if this story moved you, if the tragedy of the War Master struck even a single chord in your own beliefs, then subscribe to this channel. Because the galaxy is vast, the stories are many, and faith, even shattered, still whispers in the stars.